I mean, I think the reason that Europe is clamping down on speech critical of Islam is partly the same reason that the entire Western world is clamping down on speech that's critical of anything that is associated with group identity, which is pretty much any set of ideas that unites people. And it's a consequence of the collective decision that we've made that egalitarianism and conflict avoidance constitute the two highest virtues, and they trump everything else, including free speech. Now, why that's happened is very, very difficult thing to say. I mean, I suspect to some degree that it's a consequence of women becoming involved in the political system, which is something that we've never experienced before, and women are more agreeable by nature than men, and agreeable people are compassionate towards those they see as suffering, and that seems to include any minority, especially when you combine that with a kind of neo-Marxist doctrine that claims that anyone who has an advantage swiped it. And I think in the Islamic situation you get a real conflict there, because it's obviously the case that many Islamic practices are not commensurate with postmodern neo-Marxist feminism, let's say, but they seem to get a free pass, and I guess that's because the idea that all cultures are equal trumps the requirement for human rights for women. And maybe the other thing that's even darker is that there's a fair bit of revolutionary fervor in the more radical end of the left political spectrum, and that radical fervor is devoted towards tearing down the patriarchy, and of course that's basically Western civilization. And so because Islam isn't part of Western civilization, then it can be seen as an ally in that attempt. That's what it looks like to me. I also think, that ignorance and all of that contribute. It isn't obvious that people who are afraid of such things as Islamophobia really understand anything about Islam. I wouldn't say I understand anything about Islam, even though I've read a fair bit about it. It's very difficult to put yourself inside a different belief system. I'm somewhat apprehensive about Islam because it looks to me like it's a totalizing system as well as a religion, and it's a totalizing system because everything has to come under its purview, including law and everything that goes along with that. There's no separation between church and state, and so I don't see how that's commensurate with a Western mode of existence. And I don't think people want to have that conversation because they want to say, well, no, everyone, diverse as they are and important as that diversity is, apparently such that everyone has to be represented equally, the diversity isn't really about anything fundamental, and we can all get along without a problem. And I'm afraid that that's extraordinarily naive. And then I suppose there's also an element of something like Western guilt, I guess, perhaps, for what has been described as our imperialist past. There's been a very long-term assault on the, what would you call, on the morality of the West. We're often viewed as the rapers and pillagers of the world, and that sort of goes along with the environmentalist ethos. And so I think we do have a fair bit of guilt about that, whether it's warranted or not. History is a bloody nightmare, and it doesn't matter where you look, and I would say at least the West has brought advantages along with its disadvantages. And I think that our attitude towards individuality is fundamentally correct and absolutely vital. And I would also say that the only countries in the world that are essentially worth living in any real sense, are the ones that are predicated on the Judeo-Christian tradition and manifested in
the law is the border that stops someone from stealing your laptop. And if it's an Apple laptop, well, it's the sort of laptop that a social justice warrior would carry. And then the social justice warrior is going to be very irritated if you happen to purloin their laptop. And then you might point out to them, it's a border. that protects you from having that thing taken. And they say, well, the border should be open. It's okay, man, no problem. You hand over that laptop right now, and everything else you own too. If you don't like borders, and you can get rid of the damn walls in your house, and you don't need doors on your bedroom either, and we can keep an eye on you whenever we want. And so much for borders. One of the things that really differs between liberals and conservatives, between the left and the right right likes tight borders between things. It's part of being conscientious at every level, conceptually, sexually, familially, provincially, nationally. The right says, look, let's keep the borders between things pretty distinct. And the left says, yeah, maybe not, because some of those borders are in the wrong place, and a little bit more free flow of information wouldn't be a bad thing. And the thing is, they're right, but so are the conservatives, and that's why you have to talk. It's like, well, we've got some borders. That's a good thing. Maybe some of them need to be moved around a little bit, and that's what the political dialogue is for. But that doesn't mean that borders themselves are a bad idea. They're a great idea, because without borders, everything mashes into the same untenable state of undifferentiated chaos, and you can't live in that. And so the people who are trying to tear down the borders conceptually, politically, and practically, what they want is the chaos that would bring. They either want that, or they're too foolish to know that their pursuits will produce that. So let's be a little bit clear that if you stand up and say, yeah, borders, they're okay. They've got their problems, but they're okay. That doesn't make you a bigot beyond redemption. It just makes you someone with some sense. And it's actually okay to be someone with some sense. Limits on immigration are also reasonable. Well, we need to figure out what those limits are, and that's what the bloody political dialogue is for. But the fact that it should be limited to some degree is also reasonable. Otherwise, why not just open the borders and let everybody come in? Well, the reason you don't do that is because a complex system cannot tolerate extensive transformation over too short a period of time. Now, you want immigrants to come in, especially if they're the sorts of immigrants who are likely to contribute properly to the success of your polity, and lots of immigrants do that. I mean, I think the vast majority, for example, of entrepreneurs in the United States come from the Indian subcontinent. So great, you know, bring them over. They're highly educated, they're extraordinarily productive, they make lots of new businesses, and then they pump money like mad back into India. Good deal. But that doesn't mean that we have our arms are open to everyone immigration policy, because it's complete rubbish. All that means is you're not thinking about it. So, and here's a coda to that for conservatives. Here's something. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. It should not be assumed that citizens of societies that have not evolved functional individual rights predicated polities will hold values in keeping with such polities. So we could say, look, there are a lot of countries in the world that are not governed well. The vast majority of them, right? And they've been not governed well forever. And to me, that means that there's something wrong with the values that are held collectively by the people who've established those polities. Well, you shouldn't be naive and assume that merely because you move them to a new country, they're going to let their innate democratic longings flourish. It doesn't work that way. So if you stand up and say, look, you know, let's be a little cautious. Let's make sure that we don't transform our society so rapidly that we lose what we have. Let's be careful about that. That doesn't mean that you're a morally reprehensible demon. It just means that you're conservative, and it's a reasonable position to hold. So there's no sense in apologizing for it. Now, that doesn't mean you get to, like, hide your bigotry under a mask of moral virtue, you know. The discrimination issue is quite clear as far as I'm concerned, so that's associated with bigotry. If you have two people who are applying for a job, you should pick the one that's most qualified and not pay any attention to any of the other attributes of the person that have nothing to do with the job. Okay. Right. I think we figured that out in about 1965. Now, we're not doing it perfectly, you know, but it's not that much later than 1965, and our society, particularly in Canada, is pretty damn open. You can come in here, and if you work hard, and if you're fortunate, you don't get sick, and God smiles on you, so to speak, you can be successful. There's still prejudice, unreasonable prejudice and discrimination, but our society is not, as the radical egalitarian equity promoters have it, structurally racist, bigoted, and misogynistic. No. Not only that, just so you know, there was a recent review published, and I mean recent, 2017, looking at that damn literature on unconscious bias. And I knew the literature to begin with. There is no evidence that unconscious bias can be measured properly, not reliably. There's also no evidence whatsoever that if you do measure it, and you can't very well, that it does any better job of predicting actual, say, bias and prejudice than just tests of attitude. So the notion that our culture is somehow structurally misogynistic and racist, and the reason for that is because of the unconscious bias of the monsters who are running it is well, maybe it's not wrong, but I can tell you one thing about it. It is not a scientifically justifiable proposition, and that's what it's being passed off as. And I place that firmly at the feet of the social psychologists, which social psychology happens to be a fairly corrupt discipline, by the way, and the people who invented the implicit association test, which measures unconscious bias, because they have not come out publicly to the degree that they should have and said, our test, which was for experimental purposes, is being misused politically. You know, your damn judges now, because of federal fiat, have to undergo mandatory unconscious bias retraining before they can sit on the bench. And so you don't think that's political re-education, it's because you're not paying attention. And there's zero evidence that it does what it's supposed to. And I would also recommend to all of you, if you happen to be in a workplace that introduces diversity training or unconscious bias training as a mandatory requirement, you tell them in no uncertain terms that you are not participating in a process that deems you bigoted and misogynistic without evidence of that being the case. And if you trot off to the training, then you've just agreed that that's who you are. And believe me, once you've agreed to that, man, you'll be agreeing to a bunch of things you don't want to agree soon afterwards. So it's time just to put a stop.